I think, Arpita, can we start? Okay. So, we've had a very fruitful discussion on the report brought out by the World Bank and the ILO already. And I look forward to, a continuation of that discussion. Let me welcome all the participants on the dais, Mr. Ajit Ghosh, Mr. Martin Rama, Sabina Diwan, Srinivasan Iyer, and Radhika Kapoor. And we have 1 hour, 15 minutes of discussion, I see, followed by a question and answer. And we are 4 speakers. So I would say 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes per speaker, or not more than that, or 10 minutes, and we can have more time for discussion. So let me kick it off by, taking advantage of the privilege of being in the chair and raise put some issues on the table which if anybody would like to respond or not respond during the discussions, or they could at best be seen as some observations. The first is that jobs and employment are a cause for concern globally and increasing interest all over the world, not only in India, not only in developing countries, but also in advanced economies. Although, the perspectives and the issues, the nitty-gritty might vary. And much of these flow from, one big issue, and that is, there was always a belief that growth and employment have a very positive relationship. You had the Phillips curve, Okun's law, but increasingly there's concern that this connection is getting increasingly weaker or decoupled. You have talk of the flattening of the Phillips curve. You have talk of, discussion over Okun's law that, the elasticities of, employment, are reducing, and whether it's still valid. And linked to those are issues of technological growth, artificial intelligence, and if you can't generate enough employment in the economy, the associated issues relating to universal basic income, which I think also has its roots on this issue. Then there are various issues surrounding employment. One is the question of measurement itself. You have unemployment rates and you have labor participation rates. You might have what you call unemployment coming down to its Nairu levels, but labor participation rates being lower than the earlier period, and you might have a secular decline. So how do you measure? You have a measurement issue. That is largely in advanced economies. In developing economies, you have this question of how do you measure it with formal, the formal sector and the informal sector. What is a job? You have things like disguised unemployment, which used to be discussed when I was in the university. The problem still remains. So you have an income, you have livelihoods, but an absence of a job, of a good quality job, does not mean that absence of a good quality job might mean that you are going in for very low productivity jobs. So are they to be put on the same footing? And that leads to questions on inequality, productivity shifts, the Kuznets curve. These are the traditional issues. But even in advanced economies where, according to the old Kuznets curve, inequality was supposed to decline because of the switch over from low productivity employment in things like agriculture to the modern sector, you see an increase in inequality, again technologically driven and perhaps linked to developments in financial markets. So you have a big debate over unemployment. And of course, finally, the linkage with trade, which is really the subject of this book, and I think the focus of our discussion today. And here again, you have different perspectives. For emerging markets, developing countries, they've always seen it as a way of supplementing your domestic demand. You have low incomes and a limited demand domestically, so you ramp it up with export through exports to raise your growth rate. And that has been the traditional model. Well, not only I would say from the 60s and 70s with the rise of East Asia and Japan, but even the critique during the colonial period, if you see, what the colonies had, the critique of the colonies was that the imperial powers were basically keeping tariffs low and exporting their way to growth. And then more recently you've had China. And so, the linkage between growth rates in OECD countries and developing countries, has always been there. But on the other hand, more recently, in advanced economies, there's been a debate on the negative impact of trade and what impact it's had on employment. And I think some of this can be, even in the report, if you look at the annex, you have reference to the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, and and some of these what you call concerns in advanced economies can actually embedded in some of the theories underlying this. And the debate over global imbalances, that countries should not actually have huge trade surpluses, was one of the pillars of discussion during, in the G20, and it continues to be so today. And you have, these animated discussions negotiations between China and the US on the question of reducing your trade surpluses. So the overall environment for trade is not very conducive. And this is something which I think economists and the political leadership need to engage, or the economists perhaps need to be more persuasive on the welfare effects of trade to keep it open. And trade GDP ratios have been falling, and so has growth has also fallen. Trend growth has fallen all across the world, and trade GDP ratios have also fallen. I suppose it would come as no surprise to economists, but that is the debate there. And finally, another issue I would like to put on the table is that according to the study, as I understand it, that the optimum strategy for a country like India is basically to have focus on labor-intensive exports, because you have the optimal welfare benefits on this. And much of this is based on historical experience, but we live in a very fast-changing world. Manufacturing is becoming less labor-intensive. And arguably, things like services, and which is an area of India's strength, traditional strength, is perhaps becoming more labor-intensive. And more than that, is becoming more tradable. The example put out by Mr. Kumar was, an example of how tradable is becoming. Services are becoming. Sitting in Orissa, you can drive, driverless cars in Arizona or somewhere, and you get an income from it. So that raises an issue coming from the discipline of history. One of the more influential pieces in our time was by a study by Alexander Gerschenkron on economic backwardness and historical perspectives. And one of his main, I think, theory, which is very interesting, is that the later you develop, well, he said industrialize, because that time industrialization, nobody could have thought that a country can think of bypassing an industrial revolution, and services was never an issue. That the later you industrialize, your lead sector of growth becomes different. And there has been some talk of whether or how feasible it is for India to utilize its advantages and services to use that for as its main engine of growth, including in exports. And that is one. And finally, that traditionally, if you look at most emerging markets, major emerging markets, India was a pretty unique in the sense that it continued to run current account deficits even while it was growing fast and exports were rising. And its domestic market, unlike East Asia and Japan, which had a limited domestic market, India has a huge domestic market. So what is there so special about exports compared to the domestic market that, that you should be focusing more on exports? And I think this debate had surfaced at the time of a few years ago on the Make in India initiative, because one of the focus areas was that it would lead to increase in exports. And then there was a debate why only exports, it should be neutral between exports and domestic markets. So I would leave it here, and then I'll go by the order here. Mr. Srinivasan Iyer.
Thank you, Alok. Thanks, ICRIER, and thanks. A very, very important, first of all, one needs to call out that the World Bank and the ILO, in framing this study, have contributed phenomenally to a central question that has informed my work at the Ford Foundation. I work at the Ford Foundation, which is that one needs to simultaneously address growth and distribution. In fact, a lot of the social justice related issues are very often because distribution is considered as a subsequent issue, that you set up things for growth and then you can take care of distribution post-production, and therefore it becomes more redistribution. And this, in a sense, joins them at the hip, as indeed they ought to be, and says that can we look at economic issues where we are looking at both growth and distribution in the same breath. And therefore, when we're saying, whether it's the purpose of states, democratic or non-democratic, is in a sense to particularly economic policy, it's not merely economic growth, it's not merely an openness to trade, it's not merely the growth of exports, but to also explore what is the nature of export growth which would have the biggest bang on jobs, because jobs are the primary route through which there is more favorable distribution. So for that, it's extremely important that this be investigated, and one must commend the World Bank and the ILO for digging deep and bringing this out. That's point number one. And now, I'm sure, Rinku, for whom I have great regard, as she said, the methodology is probably as good as it can get, so I take her word for it. So, and I'm dysfunctional as an economist, so I can't really, probe deeper than what she says. But I had one question which left me a little puzzled, that the question that seems to be answered is the impact of exports on jobs. And I hope it's not a question of the impact of trade on jobs, because if one looks at exports and imports, I hope the report's not alluding to the net impact. I mean, simply because whether one looks at sort of Topolova's report or more in greater detail, when I look at the work that we're supporting at the micro level, when we're looking at the impact of the trade environment, in fact, a set of trade policies, and when we see that Tasar silk reelers and weavers in Bhagalpur in Bihar, or in fact Banaras silk weavers, or say the Aligarh, the Aligarh lock industry, or even the Jalandhar sports, or the Meerut sports industry, how they have been significant challenges have been posed to them, and they are actually shrinking as a result of greater exposure of these sectors to trade. And this is in addition to, in fact, there was a huge debate when India was discussing free trade agreements with Southeast Asia, some of you may remember, because there was deep apprehension, and rightfully so, of the impact on that on plantation labor, including in Kerala, which Alok would be familiar with. And therefore, if you're focusing purely on growth, then I think we have some very, very strong results. If we're saying that it's about trade, then we need to be a little more careful. But however, if the methodology and the data source says that the net impact of trade on jobs is what it is, then I stand corrected. That's number one. And the second point is that which the report makes, which in fact, in my view, is the strongest and perhaps something that must really be shouted out over rooftops is the importance of the composition of exports. So there's a very, very clear delinking in terms of the impact of exports on growth, from an aggregate impact of exports, and then you drop it down to sectoral composition. And here it's no mere assertion, because even if one looks at the micro level in terms of the impact of exports on jobs, even across South Asian countries, and with Bangladesh at one extreme, ranging to through Sri Lanka to India, Pakistan's a little fuzzy because the data sources, as the report says, aren't as clear. Then very clear, so Bangladesh's reliance on labor-intensive sectors has certain more progressive implications on distribution than India's, which really has an unusual, for its level of per capita GDP, an unusual reliance on capital-intensive exports. And therefore, we see that the impact on India, which would be in many different ways, so as a result of which we see a much greater impact on wages, a much lower impact on the quantum of employment, far greater benefits for males, for folks with high skills, for folks with higher tertiary education, even while we know a major portion of India's population is really not there. And therefore, drawing our attention to the importance of the sectoral composition of exports is a very important one. It's one of the three major conclusions in my humble view. It's probably the most important conclusion, because from there, therefore, you start looking at, okay, so therefore, if you want to maximize the impact, or if you want to strengthen the impact of exports on jobs, what are the kind of policies that you choose? So then, do you merely look at sort of horizontal policies that facilitate trade, regardless of whether the trade's in capital-intensive sectors or in labor-intensive sectors, etc., then how do you modify the sectoral composition of growth? And therefore, when you're looking at economic policy, then you're necessarily driven that if you want growth and if you want exports to have a greater impact on jobs, and through jobs distribution, and therefore welfare gains, then you need to be very, very conscious that you need to go far beyond horizontal policies, whether to support growth or exports, into, in fact, vertical policies, and actually choose. So in a sense, you might need to say, how do we overcome government failure in the whole this thing about choosing certain sectors? Now, so that's a conclusion that I draw, that if you want exports to have a bigger impact on jobs, then you need to go beyond merely raising exports, but you actually need to shift the composition in favor of this thing. And I can go into detail, but that was something very, very strong and incredibly progressive, and which is something that's born on something that's so very, very rigorous. And it's born both within the report in terms of sort of inter-country comparisons, as well as more broadly in terms of when you're looking at the sectoral composition of growth, even within each country. The third point that I wanted to make, and I'll stop after that, is that when if we look beyond even the sectoral composition of growth, we also need to look further at the nature of, particularly when we are looking at those sectors where there are global value chains, where there's global fragmentation of production. If we want to improve the impact of exports on jobs, and if we want to boost gains, we might need to probe a little further. This is not to say that this report is limited. I mean, this report's done, as phenomenal progress, but I would also suggest that we might need to look beyond this to see, okay, if there are 10 sort of labor-intensive sectors, within that what is happening. And in fact, we've just supported a couple of studies which look at the garment sector in specific in India. And what we see is that if you look at the past 10 years, while working conditions in the garment sector are certainly higher, whether in terms of wages or whether in terms of working conditions, then whatever the alternatives are faced by the women who come in, typically who come and work in the garment sector. Certainly they're much better. Women walk in, vote with their own feet, and choose those jobs. However, when we see intertemporal changes, there's been a significant decline in several things. One, there's been a significant decline in wage share. So if you look at the wage share of the FOB value of the garments that are exported from India, that's actually been falling over time, and even at its best was not much higher than just 1/3, but it's actually been falling. The second thing that's happened is that in terms of the quality of work, there has also been a change. I mean, one looks at greater instances of forced overtime, one looks at greater instances of an incredible pressure in terms of work pace, and much more. And in fact, a lot of trade unions that we support are actually throwing up data. Now, that is not, in a sense, removed from the changes that are happening in the export markets itself. So as one gets granular on exports itself, one discovers that most of the global buyers who are dominating trade in these value chains are actually shifting procurement models. So you have faster fashions, for example, where there were two fashion seasons globally maybe 20 years ago. There are 6 now. So you have shorter lead times. You're also shifting costs from buyers to sellers. So typically the cost of sampling is shifted entirely to the buyer. Or if there's a change in orders, the cost is shifted to the buyer. So as one moves along, as one moves in fact from an undifferentiated approach to trade to a differentiated approach which recognizes that imports and exports may be pulling in different directions. As one moves further and looks at exports and says that the impact of capital-intensive vis-a-vis labor-intensive sectors would have a different impact on labor. And then as one goes into the labor-intensive sectors and says there are certain business models within procurement, and procurement practices within these which are better for labor in terms of higher wage share and better conditions. So you clearly see a pathway whereby you can actually transform and make trade more beneficial and raise the gains from trade. And therefore that, I do not for a moment say that this report is incomplete in itself. It's extremely rich, but these are sort of further questions that arise as we look at this. And in itself, the report sort of quite, in fact, it raises questions very, very centrally and loudly, which one does not normally hear in the sphere of public policy discussion in India, which is how do you sort of combine through the same set of policy decisions a simultaneous sort of progress on growth and distribution, and that's essentially through employment in the jobs market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Srinivasan. I'm sorry I forgot to introduce that he's from the Ford Foundation in India. And next we have Sabina. She's President and Executive Director of Just Jobs Network. All yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I wanted to thank ICRIER, ILO, and World Bank for the invitation to be here today. And it's a real honor for me to be on this panel with such esteemed speakers. Dr. Ghosh, you know I can't ever be on the same panel with you without acknowledging what a mentorship role Dr. Ghosh has played in my professional career. And to be able to comment on a report, Daniel, your work on labor provisions in trade agreements has been very instructive in my work as well. So just wanted to acknowledge that and congratulate the authors of this report on a very good, valuable piece of work. I think for a long time there's been this blind faith in globalization and with trade as one of its main drivers, that globalization and trade would fuel growth and this would automatically lead to a rising living standards. And we are now clearly seeing the limitations of this view. I think it has become explicit now that trade restructures labor markets and in the process calls for major adjustments and sometimes very painful adjustments. And in that spirit, I think that a report that examines the impact of exports on jobs and that makes that link between the world of trade and the world of work, I think is a very valuable addition to the research and to the discourse. So thank you for that. I think the other point is that the report also underscores something that Srinivasan just mentioned, which is the fact that the composition of economic growth matters, right? The view that if you create economic growth, that development and jobs will come automatically is way more pervasive than I personally would like. And I think we need to take a step back and look at, from the beginning, what methods do we deploy to promote economic growth? And that also then lends itself to what kinds of social mechanisms we need in order to redistribute or distribute the gains from trade. So I think, again, that this report lends itself to the view that exports as an important driver of the composition of growth, that exports can have a positive impact on employment, and that's, I think, an important message to take from this. Given the context of trade in the region and in developing countries in general, and countries in particular at sort of India's stage of development, perhaps not directly, but indirectly, I have gleaned 5 sort of recommendations or messages from this report. The first has come up a couple of times already this morning, which is that we need to deliberately foster a labor-intensive manufacturing sector. And this, of course, comes with its own set of policy requirements, and I don't have enough time to sit here and talk about everything that's required for fostering a labor-intensive manufacturing sector. But needless to say, as we are thinking about fostering a labor-intensive manufacturing sector, we need to think about, of course, how automation will affect labor-intensive manufacturing in the future. And along the same vein, we can't ignore what Alok has already just brought up, which is that, in a tech-driven world, we should also be focusing on harnessing the potential of outsourcing of services and exports of services. This report doesn't particularly address the impact of exports on services on jobs, but perhaps Daniel and Gladys, that's a part 2 of this report that could assess that specific impact. Needless to say that we often in the discourse hear manufacturing and services pitted against one another. I think that we have to be very clear that in order for an economy like India's, and particularly in India, we need both. We need labor-intensive manufacturing and we need services growth. The question then becomes, in terms of policy, which one do you prioritize and how do you go about prioritizing it, particularly with a view to the future of this technologically driven economy. The other thing we need to be mindful of in the context of labor-intensive manufacturing is this idea of reshoring. I believe that the lure of the large and growing labor markets and markets of the Asian economies are enough for investors and manufacturers to establish operations here, right? But we cannot deny that there is now evidence, for example, with Adidas and Nike and so on, that are using sort of 3D printing and other technological means and shifting production back to the global north. Perhaps this is an exaggerated, we know this is happening. Perhaps it won't happen with a great level or impact in the future. That might be the case. Nonetheless, I know that some economies like Vietnam, for example, are actually thinking through this issue. And so any country that's thinking about a labor-intensive manufacturing sector needs to think about the role of technology, needs to think about the possibility of reshoring. And then, of course, as Srinivasan mentioned, how do we protect against import shocks, right? So in the context of India, if we are to remove impediments like the inverted duty structure, right? We know, for example, in the automotive sector, which is one of the most successful sectors, there's two reasons why I think automotive has been successful in India. One is that we actually had a plan for the sector between 2006 and 2016. And the second is the fact that the inverted duty structure does not apply to auto manufacturing. And so if we remove impediments like the inverted duty structure, what does this mean in terms of a potential influx of imports, and how do we protect against that? Now, I'm raising this as a question. It would be good to have other inputs on that. And then again, as Srinivasan mentioned, this idea of the composition of exports. So it's not just that exports play an important role in sort of our economic growth strategy, but also what should that composition of exports be? And where should those factories be set up, right? There are spatial considerations that we need to take into account. And then the next phase of that will be, depending on where they are and what we specialize in, then how do we skill the population in order to be able to foster this kind of export-driven growth? So that's all in the basket of labor-intensive manufacturing. My second recommendation with regards that I've gleaned from this report is the fact that we need to build export capacity for those SMEs that are poised to take advantage of this particular opportunity. Not all small and medium, micro, small and medium enterprises are created equal. Some are more poised to take advantage of exports, and we need to foster those particular SMEs to realize their export potential. And I think Radhika is probably better equipped to go into that in more detail based on her research. The third recommendation I have is that in order to realize the potential of exports, inevitably a country like India needs to engage in bilateral, regional, but also multilateral trade, and the strengthening of multilateral trade and reform of the WTO. That has not come up this morning at all, and I think that that's something very valuable for us to consider. Exports don't happen. We need to actually be engaging in a range of different trading arrangements, and the value and the role of multilateral trade in that context is very important, as is the role of the WTO. The fourth recommendation is that we should stake a claim in global value chains, particularly as China potentially vacates some of the spaces, right? But I think for me, while this is self-evident that we need to be more participatory in global value chains, this poses some very real questions. Have we missed the boat on the potential to claim our share in some of these value chains? And what kind of model of development do we actually want to pursue? So we heard this morning repeatedly about Bangladesh, right? I would argue that the Bangladesh model in textiles and garments is not one that we should actually be following. It is one of very low value added development trajectory. We know that the conditions that women face in the labor market are deplorable. We've seen a number of factory disasters. So this Bangladesh model of sort of low value added production, coupled with the fact that the economy is not very diversified, so you then have excessive pressure on working conditions and wages because all the workers are concentrated in one sector, right, which depresses wages and conditions. That is not the model of development to follow. So when we're talking about participation in global value chains, should we be also looking at other countries like Vietnam, for example, and Martin is a huge expert on Vietnam, but Vietnam, for example, is pursuing a much more broad-based, diversified strategy of participation in value chains. A couple more very quick points on value chains. One is this idea of participating in value chains and whether we've missed the boat or not also begs the question, which I think Alok raised, about domestic consumption, right? What is the value of production for domestic consumption? And to what extent should we be focusing on an export-led model of growth? This, particularly since the global economy is shifting so fast, we need to, I think, ask those kinds of questions. And the last point with regards to global value chains is, I think, we really, when we talk about participation in global value chains, need to acknowledge and understand the fact that trade is no longer administered at an arm's length between countries, right? We are increasingly looking at a world where in value chains, it's actually corporations. Trade is conducted through private contracts between corporations, right? And how do we govern this sort of new arrangement? How do we look at regulating and monitoring the private sector and this sort of conduct of trade through the private law of contracts, which is very different from sort of engaging in broad trade agreements. And I think that's worth digging deeper into. And my final point is one that is relevant. When I was in Washington, D.C., working on trade issues, there was a big debate around how trade was impacting employment. And one of the big questions there is, to what extent does trade policy affect outcomes? And to what extent do other policies have to also chip in to actually bring about the jobs and development outcomes that we'd like to see? And what do I mean by that? First of all, I think in a world where there's growing precaritization of work, there's growing contractualization of work, I think this report talks about sort of the increasing formalization, but the dichotomy between informality and formality is becoming increasingly blurred. You may actually have formal sector enterprises with informal employment, right? And so we need to be very nuanced when we talk about shifting people from informal to formal. We need to be very nuanced about that. And a broader policy agenda that actually provides a social protection floor, provides basic health care, provides pensions, provides potentially unemployment insurance, maybe not in the context of India, but in other countries, minimum wage. Those are all a basket of policies that can be conducive to a better functioning labor market that need to be considered as part of a scenario where we are looking at exports and harnessing exports for job creation. And the last point that with regards to this broader policy agenda that I wanted to make was just something that Rinku had pointed out this morning, which really struck me as well, is the fact that this kind of export growth is actually benefiting the more educated workers. In an economy where we are always now talking about the skill-biased nature of technological change, the idea that even exports is skill-biased is hugely disturbing, right? How do we institute basic education and skills development policies as a spectrum to actually break the path dependence of people of lower socioeconomic levels, right? If exports aren't going to provide them with the jobs and technology is going to be skill biased, we actually need an active policy agenda for people that are the most disadvantaged in our communities in order to be able to create rising living standards and shared prosperity for all. So I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabina. Now I would request Radhika, who's a senior fellow in ICRIER, my colleague here, to...
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Let me start by congratulating the World Bank and ILO for putting together what is a very, very pertinent report at this time. As India is grappling with the challenge of creating productive jobs for a large, rapidly rising young workforce, we often turn to the success stories of the East Asian economies and try to understand whether we can replicate their model of driving growth and job creation through export-led manufacturing. And this report actually provides some very important insights and clues to address that question. And I hope that our policymakers will get those clues and insights from this report. What's particularly interesting is that you look directly at the impact of exports on labor markets. There's a lot of literature on looking at the impact on growth, but looking at labor market outcomes, not just employment and wages, but also the distributional impacts that you presented. I mean, all of that is very pertinent. So thank you very much for that report. Before actually going into now, into much of the report, I can't help but mention what Dr. Sheel has already mentioned and Sabina alluded to as well, is that we are having this conversation in a country with 1 billion+ people. And we have a very large internal domestic market. And if we can first focus on trying to actually meet that domestic demand. That domestic demand in itself can be a very important and sustainable driver of both growth and job creation. Having said that, though, it's not that simple, because what it requires is increasing rural demand, increasing demand amongst the poor sections of the society, which in turn requires creating more productive jobs for them, creating more productive enterprises that can actually offer them more well-paying, better quality jobs that give them more disposable income, and therefore this domestic demand increases. And of course, there are other things as well. GST is a step in that direction towards creating one strong, unified domestic market and reducing the transaction costs of doing business and the costs across states. Of course, physical infrastructure can go a long way in addressing that issue as well. So I think it's important to recognize that we do have this large domestic demand which we need to cater to. Having said that, I'm definitely not advocating any kind of export pessimism. And all I'm really saying is that we have to be careful about relying on a strategy or a policy whose dominant focus is exports. Because we've been hearing all morning that relying on such a strategy has limitations for various reasons. A, because we are seeing rising protectionist tendencies the world over. B, because we see various developed countries resorting to automation to compete with cheap labor elsewhere. And also, interestingly, in terms of the ability of exports to generate jobs in India. What your report brings out very carefully, the data analysis brings out, is that if you actually look at the composition of the export basket, that in itself is a very telling story about the role of exports in creating jobs in India. And Srinivasan and both Sabina spoke about this extensively. But the evolution of the export basket in India has basically mirrored the sort of structural transformation that we have seen in the economy overall. We have seen this phase of transformation from agriculture-led growth to service-led growth, leapfrogging the phase of manufacturing-led growth. And even in our export basket, what we've seen is that the share of services has been rising, while that of manufactured goods has been falling. And even within the manufactured goods, what we find is that the share of the low skill, the more labor-intensive, the low-tech items has been falling, but that of the high-tech and the medium-tech items has been rising. So, the result that you get about changing the composition of exports towards more labor-intensive commodities is a key takeaway from this report for me. And like Srinivasan, I also had a question about the role of imports. This report, as I understand, looks at the impact of exports on imports. Exports on labor market outcomes. But I wonder how you factored in the imports into this analysis. Also because some of the very export-intensive items in India rely a lot on imported inputs. And one of the results that you have in your study really is that higher exports do not correlate with higher aggregate employment, at least of local labor markets. So I was trying to reconcile why you are getting that result. Is it just a function of the composition of the export basket that we have, or does it also have something to do with factoring in the imports into the analysis? Also, again, Sabina and Srinivasan both have touched on the role of GVCs. And I think that we cannot emphasize enough the importance of integrating into global value chains if we actually want to survive competition and create create jobs. But again, over here, I mean, though India's participation has been quite low in GVCs, it is rising, but there might be limits to which we can actually integrate in GVCs, A, because of rising tendencies of automation. Sabina, you mentioned 3D printing and all the new kinds of technologies which underlie the fourth industrial revolution, which seem to suggest that labor will no longer be the key deciding factor when firms are deciding where to locate production. But that's not the only reason, actually. Srinivasan, you alluded to the fast fashion concept. So changing consumer preferences and the rise of fast fashion also require that all these firms that are engaged in GVCs should be able to actually produce very large quantities, the scale at a large scale, at a very quick turnaround time. And whether the firms we're actually in India have the ability to be able to adapt, that will also be a very important factor in determining whether there's going to be offshoring, onshoring, so on and so forth. The other issue, again, which both the speakers before me have alluded to, is that much of our participation in GVCs is at the very low end. Now, of course, you know, there is considerable amount of concern about this. And if we actually look at the composition of the structure of the GVCs, you've got a few lead firms, and you have a very large number of supplier firms. And so it's a bit of a monopsonistic structure in these markets. And as a result of it, much of the value is getting captured in the lead firms and not in the supplier firms. So the workers who are working in the supplier firms are actually getting just about minimum wages. So therefore, if we want to create these better quality jobs through exports in particular, how can we have some sort of a governance or a regulatory architecture that we can ensure that they get at least living wages? But having said that, I am completely aware of the fact that you have all this contract manufacturing that you see in India, especially in the garment industry. It has created a number of jobs. We can argue that these are at the low end of the value chain. They are not the best quality jobs. But at the same time, all these firms which are engaged in Tirupur or even in Bangladesh would have never been able to sell billions of dollars of garments had they not been engaged in global value chains. But at the same time, there has to be an effort, as multiple speakers have said over the course this morning, to actually move up the value chain, and that, of course, entails enhancing the competitiveness. Now, another key issue also is that most of our labor-intensive sectors, which are exporting, are basically dominated by MSMEs. So the question of how these MSMEs can be engaged in global value chains, because they also don't have the potential to go and export directly to markets. So they need to be in that global value chain. They need to have the lead firm as an anchor to be able to sell their goods. So how can those be integrated in this kind of analysis to create these better quality jobs? So now, just a couple of interesting results that come out from your report. You look at the impact of exports on wages, and you find that if the value of exports goes up by about $100, the average annual wage increase is just 572 rupees. I mean, this actually is quite a low figure, and it was a bit alarming. But what is interesting is that, of course, the wage improvements are differential across college graduates and urban workers and the very lowly educated workers. I mean, in some ways, this is unsurprising because, again, if you look at our export basket, it's largely dominated by very capital-intensive, skill-intensive items. So since these are the industries which are exporting and are also likely to be hiring more skilled workers, the fact that these people would get the benefits and the gains from exports in terms of higher wages makes sense. But then this again points to the importance of actually changing the composition of the export basket so that the gains can be distributed more widely. And this is even more pertinent in the context of a country like India, because even though we have rising education levels, the fact of the matter is that a large proportion of our population has still very low levels of education. So if we actually have to think of seriously creating more jobs through exports, we have to think about how these kind of people can get those jobs. Now, a very interesting finding, which I found in your report, is that you said that higher exports seem to draw workers from informal to formal jobs, and increased exports can explain conversions about 800,000 jobs from informal to formal. Now, the channel through which this transition happens from an informal to a formal job is not very clear. You mentioned that, I think the argument given was that the decrease in informality is possibly because exports to high-income countries come from formal firms which employ lower shares of informal workers. Now, I've read the executive summary only. I haven't gone into the technical definitions. But I'm just trying to understand, because we do have a large body of literature which suggests that as there has been increased trade openness, the firms which are actually exporting, they have resorted to the use of more contract labor to cut costs. And that amounts to basically informalization of the workforce in the formal sector. So I'm just trying to understand. I presume you've done this using household surveys, and therefore the enterprise definition of it being a formal or an informal firm doesn't come in. But I think when we have the conversation about quality jobs, and that's really the key issue in India, about good quality productive jobs, we need to factor that into account. Also, I found this a little baffling because, India globally is largely perceived to, this is not my view, and I'm not going to get into a debate about this right now, but it is essentially perceived as having very rigid labor regulations. So if these firms are exporting, and if it's basically to meet some kind of temporary or seasonal demand, it seems highly unlikely to me that they're actually going to be taking on formal permanent workers. So I'd really be interested in understanding the channel behind this, because even though your report says that on net there might not be new jobs, but you're actually seeing conversion of informal to formal jobs. And if we can understand that transmission mechanism, I think it's very important also from the policy perspective. Yes, so on that note, I would like to conclude, and thank you very much for that report again. And again, just to say that, while exports can be a sort of turbocharger for growth and job creation, I think domestic demand is a more sustainable engine of job creation for India. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. I would now call upon Professor Ghosh, Professor in Institute of Human Development.
Thank you. Well, I would like to start by thanking ICRIER for inviting me here. And like all my other co-panelists, I would like to congratulate World Bank and the ILO for collaborating on this kind of a study, which was needed, because we talk about these things, but in terms of actual empirical evidence, is not always followed up. Now let me start by making a few comments on. I have actually quickly read through the report, so correct me if I have got it wrong, but I would like to make a few points on the report, on this study to begin with. One is, and I think this has been mentioned, that when we talk about trade, we talk about trade. We don't talk about just export or just import, and the whole theoretical expectations are based on the idea of comparative advantage, factor endowments, and so on. And the reason it is supposed to be beneficial is usually that, being a country where factor endowments are, in terms of labor, unskilled labor, so that's how trade would work, and this would be brought to work if we are open to trade, and that's how the employment effect would come through, and employment would benefit more skilled workers and so on. Now, so I was a little surprised to see, although these things are there in the report, but there isn't anything. First of all, it's of course only exports, and there's nothing on the import side. Although a study has been cited, Topalova, I think, which shows that actually import liberalization destroyed jobs, right? By using the same methodology, her finding comes through. Now the thing that strikes one is that if imports are destroying, imports destroy jobs and exports create jobs, there's some need to think of on a net effect of trade opening. And the thing is, all these countries of South Asia actually run trade deficit and very large trade deficits. So imports are larger, and then so one would from that fact alone, one would tend to think that the trade opening, trade as such, actually has been on a net basis, job destroying rather than job creating. So I was a bit surprised to see that although the studies are cited, but there hasn't been an attempt to actually think along this right, because trade liberalization means you will both exports and imports will rise, and if the situation is that the imports rise faster than exports, which is what South Asian experience seems to be, then of course you don't get even though I might identify benefits of exports, you don't get, because simply you just cannot open up exports. You have to open trade. So that's something that perhaps one think about. Coming to the very interesting findings of the report, I think the basic result is, from what I understood, also from the presentation, the growth of exports increases wages and formality, but doesn't have much of an effect on overall employment, which I think is it's also mentioned in the report why it may not show any effect on aggregate employment because of the nature of employment here. And I think that's probably correct. I mean, in the sense that if the employment is mostly, since nobody can be, everybody has to work, and so you already have the employment. The question is only what kind of employment you have, and so this only shows up in a movement from, say, informal to formal. Although the kind of questions Radhika raised, I think they are pertinent in this case. I mean, I don't quite know whether I have not read through it, so how formality has been defined, by what criteria, and whether this, because what we normally see, at least because since you do not consider services exports, I would be less surprised if that were there. But we are talking about merchandise and manufacturers exports, and there, from what we see, what we know, is that informality is growing. Whereas it says that somehow formality grows when exports. So it's a bit of surprise. Now, I'm not saying, therefore, that it is not correct, but it's something that needs to be further looked at. And the other surprising result for me is that the largest wage rewards go to the most educated, and therefore creates wage inequality, actually. Right? Now, my surprise is that this result holds for India as well as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, if I got it right. Now the thing is that think of Bangladesh and India. In the case of Bangladesh, apparel garments, this is the 75% or 80% of something of that order. Whereas in India, that's way down. Actually, the top exports are more capital intensive, right? For India, but both countries giving out the same result, that the effect of exports on wages are increasing much more for the highly skilled and not for the less skilled. Now, I would have expected, at least in Bangladesh, that effect to come more for the low-skilled. So it surprised me. Again, I don't know. I mean, it may well be, but I cannot think of why it could be that way. The other related result also is that, again, if I read it right, that wage growth is higher for services workers, even when exports are manufacturers, right? I don't know if I've got it right. The workers in the services sector, indirect effect, I suppose, but it shows, that wage growth is higher for services workers than for manufacturing workers. Now, once again, this might well link up with the higher growth for high-skilled workers, but again, I couldn't quite understand how this, again, the transmission sort of, how does it come about if I've got the result, I've read the result right. So these are some of the things that are striking for me, and I mentioned them too, so that we can picture. Now, let me make a few comments on the more general issues, some of which have been raised already. One is, it has been said that today, there is a rise of protectionism in the developed world, right? And it looks like, even if we wish to increase exports or to go for a more export-oriented kind of growth, there are problems of actually achieving that at this point of time. But another factor, I think, which again has been mentioned, is this effect of the Industry 4 technology. Now, the question there is, and I think as far as trade side is concerned, the question there is that how would this change the global value chains? Because today, of course, trade involves integration into value chains. Is it actually going to, or broader question, comparative advantage? How is it going to change the comparative? Is it, for example, going to be the case that the traditional, idea of comparative advantage and factor endowments and so on would be totally upset, in which case trade becomes a different thing altogether? Is it the case that in global value chains, what we call the trade in tasks, that even in global value chains, we thought more labor-intensive, kind of tasks would be carried out in the less developed economies, etc. Is that going to be upset by the Industry 4 technology? How will, that's a question that needs to be asked at this point.